Part two. Hi, everyone. My name is Min Song, and I'm at Boston College. And I also get to play moderator. So welcome to this event. It was several weeks ago when I tweeted that I was planning on reading Frank Herbert's classic science fiction novel, Dune. And I asked if anyone wanted to join me. At the time, I thought it was a good idea to read the book because the film adaptation was supposed to be released in December. And as we know, that has been delayed like so much of everything this year. But nevertheless, it did give the Phantom opening, gave us an interesting occasion to revisit a novel that I think we can all agree has left a major impact on the genre of science fiction and on popular culture writ large. And the Phantom occasion also gave me time to think, what would it be like to reread this novel that I read with such interest when I was growing up? Would I find it as exciting as when I first read it? And what would I notice that my younger self was oblivious to? I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised in retrospect that my tweet was greeted with enthusiasm. And many of you wrote right away to say that you too would want to read this book. And we decided at that time that we would do a Twitter book club. So that original group of about 10 people put together a schedule, which in retrospect was probably too slow. Many of you raced ahead, though I have to say I have not had the attention to read long chunks of prose. So the schedule was actually just right for me. And then also to gather every Monday to tweet our thoughts about the novel. What I didn't realize when we began this is how much I would look forward to our discussions on Mondays. They were the highlights of a otherwise unusually dismal and dispiriting semester when I was teaching all of my courses remotely. And my social interactions weren't necessarily limited. So the book club became for me a kind of lifeline to community beyond my immediate family and an opportunity as well to engage in serious discussions that ranged widely from the history of science fiction to gender, race, imperialism, Orientalism, political philosophy, Jungian psychology, and so on and so forth. The variety of topics we talked about was immense. I want to thank the ASAP Journal for allowing us to hold this Zoom meeting as part of their Thinking What series. And just so that you know, we're recording the session and that recording will be made public through the journal's website. I also want to thank the 9 other people who helped me to organize this group. We decided the format for today's meeting. And we decided that each of us would speak for 3 minutes about whatever it is we wanted to say about Dune. And we're going to go alphabetically. And then after we're done, I want to make sure to invite all the people here today who tweeted on Mondays, but aren't part of the original 9. To share whatever thoughts they'd like, and then we'll open up the meeting to a general conversation, and we can go for as long as an hour and a half, though certainly if we run out of steam before then, we can stop. So the 9 speakers in alphabetical order are Deborah Ray Cohen of the University of South Carolina, James Gifford of Farley Dickinson, Vincent Haddad of Central State University in Ohio, Lee Constantinou, University of Maryland at College Park, Sheila Lyman of Champlain College in Vermont, Jason Parks at Anderson University in Indiana, Leif Sorensen at Colorado State University, Drew Strombeck at Wright State University, and Kyla was Anna Tompkins at Pomona College. If she joins us, we'll speak as well. And I've asked each person to time themselves and really to keep themselves to 3 minutes. And I have just used up my 3 minutes doing the introduction, so I'm done. Yay! So Deborah, why don't you get us started?
I'm Deborah Ray Cohen, and I want to thank Min, first of all, for creating this occasion, because it's been absolutely wonderful. And for me, actually the only saving grace in the last 9 months. So I'm going to leave for others more qualified the novel's position in the context of the planetary, the climatological, and the colonial, and come back to some of the concerns that we've discussed from the beginning about form, about prolepsis, and the differing processes of historiography and mythification we see at work in the book. The last line of Dune, not counting the appendices, the last line of Dune, as we've noted, is supremely ironic. Jessica says to Chani, as a consolation for the knowledge that Paul will marry the Princess Irulan, history will call us wives. Even leaving aside its significance in terms of the foreclosing of the possibilities of gender within the book, something else I'd love to talk about if we have time, we already know what history will say. From the outset, everything in the book is already thrown into ironic relief by Irulan, and the presence in epigraph of the official histories we know will be written that she in fact will write. Jessica may cast Irulan as irrelevant to history, but we already know that she's its custodian. In this sense, the book undercuts both of the historiographic modes it offers up. Paul's prescience tied to his terrible purpose, and what we might call the Bene Gesserit's predictive self-fulfilling prophecy. The epigraphs render moot all of Paul's qualms and resistance, even as the advent of his destiny collapses, or so it seems in this novel, the Bene Gesserit's purpose. All of the dithering we've compared to both Hamlet and Thomas Covenant, the anguish of the chosen one is useless or meaningless, unless we care about Paul's adolescent sensibilities. His destiny is always already managed. I should say that I've also been increasingly fascinated in this regard since we finished our reading of the book at the significance in this connection of Gurney Halleck. Gurney is a bard, and as such the repository of both mythic and official history tied to the Atreides family. Jessica looks to him as always able to give the perfect quotation, the perfect emotional counterpoint drawn from an archive of balladry. But his presence also bespeaks the processes of mythification. He's Paul's bard. In that sense, he's Irulan before the fact. Thinking about Gurney makes me think in turn about the significance of the wandering balisets within the text, the one that gets rescued from the thopter, the one belonging to Jameis that Paul takes at the wake in his real acknowledgement of his position among the Fremen. His choice of the baliset seems to accord himself the right to write the history of the Fremen, but this is a history that is literally within the text already written. Given this foreclosing, the movement of the later books to render Paul's legacy explicitly disastrous feels almost redundant, because it is too, in a sense, preempted by the formal structure of this novel. Thanks.
Thanks, Deborah. That was amazing. Next is James.
Thank you, Min. So I thought I would talk originally about, say, Lawrence Durrell's Alexandria Quartet as a precursor or predecessor text, and I'm not. And I thought I'd talk about anarchism, not libertarianism in Herbert, and increasingly, no, I don't think that's there, unfortunately. So I kept going back to my repeated failure to read Herbert's Soulcatcher. I kept trying and kept failing and not able to finish it. I finished it. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Charlie Hobuhut, who becomes Katsuk in that novel, and the young innocent David, who becomes Hokwat. And I'm going to say that there's some big parallels here, and I think they inform Dune. See, we get the renaming of Paul Atreides as Modib. We get Charlie as Katsuk. Both books have dream visions. There's the similarity of the Fremen. not just to desert dwellers or Bedouin, but to indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest. That's been commented on. Both novels have the death of an innocent child as the herald of historic change and the redirection of historic timelines. Both books seek to prevent cultural stagnation and, decline a la some kind of Spenglerian Der Untergang des Abendlandes, the decline of the West, if I'm allowed to put German and French together like that. And then, the last, like what I care about most, which is the conflict between, say, the narrative voice and the book's form. Because we got like what the book says, and then we got how it goes about saying it. So, the ending that Deborah Ray has pointed to, history will call us wise, is not only deeply patriarchal, I'm valuable because I got the right guy, but, Ireland is literally calling them concubines. Like, this is literally the ending of the book. That's not happening. So ironic in the way Deborah points out, we get the narrative voice interjecting to stress interpretations that say the book's genre pulls us away from, like the way it's structured works against what it says. So there's, obviously anti-colonial takes, rebutting Lawrence's Seven Pillars of Wisdom, book that sits behind Earl as well. And there's, the outspoken anti-fascism of the book, but, despite this, the fascists really like the book. And it really engages in colonial tropes. So what's the same about these two things, going back to Soulcatcher, and what's different? And basically, Charlie Hobuhat is indigenous, and Paul is a mighty whitey, if I can borrow Noah Berlatsky's phrasing. And this is why the ending of Dune is, despite its intentions, a triumph of the will, I guess, even though it's a catastrophe for humanity. And the ending of Soulcatcher is a tragic failure that's almost universally reviled by everybody who's ever approached the book. This ending's wrong. They're the same ending. The innocent dies so that historical transformation is enabled to move forward. So what's the difference? Well, one of them's white and one of them's not. And that, to me, is how the ideology of the form contradicts what the narrative voice wants or seems to want us to take away from both books in that instance. And that's, like, to me, really where I'm interested in talking about the conflicts going on with Herbert. So that's what I got.
Thanks so much, James. That was great. Vincent?
Hi, thank you. So I think I was one of the few people in the book club for whom this was their first ever experience with Dune or any related Herbert-verse content. Since it was the Villeneuve trailer that sparked my interest, it primed me to wonder a bit about what the contemporary valences of this text were, why Dune now, aside from the obvious smashing of the nostalgia button so prevalent in pop culture. Like how the Heart of Darkness aesthetically mapped onto the Vietnam War, what could this, as Andrew Robert so persuasively lays out, artifact of the American investment in the modernization and decolonization of Middle Eastern and North African countries during the Cold War, map onto today as an art of the present. The fetishization of Arabic culture with the Fremen people was what first struck me when this book club began. In that vein, we might brainstorm a variety of events that Dune has the potential to help us think about. The Iraq War, the Arab Spring, or how climate change accelerated the Syrian refugee crisis, or the Iran nuclear deal with Paul's use of atomics. As the Fremen are also based or inspired by Native Americans, I think Standing Rock's water protectors may be another appropriate lens for thinking about the text. But I think as the narrative is constructed and relayed, focalized through the perspective of a number of characters, almost all of whom are members of or aides to the colonizing guild, it may not effectively map onto any of these contemporary events or issues without being dramatically remixed or reconfigured. I wondered what potential forms the text might take as various minor character elaborations from the perspective of Chani, Stilgar, or Shade Out Mapes. That's my first time saying her name. I don't know if that's how you say it. And as a visual cinematic experience, what it would look like to actually shape and communicate this story with any reconciliation of an Arabic perspective on imperialism, militarism, or environmentalism, maybe even with more casting or really any casting of Arabic actors in the movie, whose representation in popular media is severely limited, most often as a terrorist, and limiting. So that is my thoughts for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Vincent. That was great. Next up is Lee.
Thank you, Min, for organizing this, and this has been a lot of fun to participate in. This is my second time through Dune, and already I kind of feel an urge to respond to what's already been said rather than sort of offer my own remarks, but I'll save that. I guess there were three kind of broad points I wanted to make, very much in line with what I was saying on Twitter as we were reading along, and very much in kind of harmony with the point that James made about the form kind of working against the overt ideological claims that Herbert might want to make about what Dune is doing. I guess what really struck me reading Dune this time was the way that Herbert marries a critique of mid-century image culture, the kind of thing that someone like Daniel Boorstin was criticizing in his book, The Image, what he was calling the pseudo-event, with self-conscious exploration of the use of myth and mythic tropes in science fiction explicitly. And, you know, I've kind of started to think of Herbert as engaging in a kind of proto-structuralism, right? Like he is interested in myth as a cultural structure. He's interested in the way that mythic narratives can be used to consolidate kind of different ideological positions, can be used to shape and mold history. And yet, you know, I feel at the same time that like Herbert isn't entirely in control of these materials. You know, like on the one hand, he wants to offer a kind of critique of the use of these myths and tropes. And yet I think there is a reason that neo-reactionary thought has been so warm and welcoming to Dune. I mean, I think the neo-reactionary embrace of Dune is in many ways a misreading of the novel. And yet you can kind of see how they're both kind of both sides of the same coin. You know, the kind of critique that you might get of mythic modes of storytelling as a form of ideological control finds its counterpart in thinker, and I use this term loosely, like Jordan Peterson, who says, yes, that's the point. This is what we want. We want to use these kind of Christian myth legends to, you know, make sure that people do what we want them to do, right? So I think this is the kind of dilemma that Dune enacts. It is inviting us to take a kind of sardonic relation to its own mythic storytelling structure, and yet, like Paul, it gets caught up in its own myth. And this is where I think the allegories of fandom, you know, the Fremen as kinds of sort of super fans can actually take on real potency, and we can kind of see the subsequent sequels of Dune as Herbert's attempt to wrestle with his own lack of control over these materials. And so that's kind of what I think would be fun to talk about. You know, like, why do we keep reading Dune? Why is it still compelling? Are we implicating ourselves in something in finding it so compelling? Or maybe I'm just speaking for myself. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Lee. That's a terrific question to end with. Sheila, you want to speak?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. And thank you, Min, for putting this together. This has been a lot of fun to, you know, kind of look forward to every week. So I appreciate that. Apologies for the somewhat scattered thoughts that I'm about to share with you on the book. I struggled to engage critically with this book, even as I enjoyed reading it. To be sure, I found plenty to critique, and I did at points, contributing in my own slightly sarcastic fashion to our group's Twitter hashtag. But I was cognizant of the fettered nature of those critiques when they arose, of the almost foregone quality of them. A few years back, when I first read Dune, I did so because I was considering teaching it. In my previous university post, I taught a class on environmental literature that tended to fill up with commercial aviation students, future pilots, almost all of them male, who took the class less because they were interested in the subject and more because it fulfilled a number of requirements and was held at an advantageous time, which prompted their department to buy up seats for them en masse. I thought the overt masculinity of Dune would register with these young pilots to be, and I'm still confident that it would have if I had taught it. But I ran into the same problem back then as I do now, the book's seeming imperviousness to critique, its shrugging off of efforts at serious intervention. Perhaps this quality arises from its datedness, or else perhaps it stems from the way that the book privileges action and plot over the sort of tension and conflict that we lit scholars are sometimes taught to seek out and engage with. Or perhaps it is an effect of the book's approach to dramatic irony, the way that things which feel obvious to us as contemporary readers somehow elude the fictional inhabitants of Arrakis. For example, take this quotation from page 334 in the fancy schmancy new hardback anniversary edition, which is the one that I used. Quote, "A thought spread across Paul's mind, clear, distinct. The real wealth of a planet is in its landscape, how we take part in that basic source of civilization, agriculture." Now some, and by some, I mean folks like probably Karl Marx and every materialist critic ever after him, would remind us that wealth is to be originally found in agriculture, that this is the origin point for our understanding of value and wealth. So what explains Paul's sudden realization so late into the book and so far into his time on Arrakis that there is value to be found in the land itself, the land that possesses and produces the coveted spice? This is characteristic of the way that the world of Dune strikes me as being a world unto itself, one which resembles our own in certain ways, yet appears to exist and play by different rules entirely, to the point of hiding what feels like common human knowledge from its own not quite human characters. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was hardly disorganized. Jason, will you speak next?
Yeah, sure. Just want to thank you again for putting this together, and just wonderful to see everybody in motion. I started this as a new reader, so this was my first time picking up the book, and I wanted to get into it, and so I was looking for an opportunity. So it was sort of there, and so I was also starting off the semester teaching my once every 4 years medieval British literature course, so the Age of Chaucer. So I thought, okay, this will be interesting, sort of to have my mind sort of working through medieval genres, starting with the romance and then drama and then mystics and even the sort of Piers Plowman and sort of these, all these medieval British genres, and at the same time reading Dune. So I decided sort of to just each week see what kinds of connections map, together, and some weeks it was kind of interesting, and I would see this, fairly obviously, like sort of, okay, we have dukes and we have sort of these various political structures, that mirror each other, or and these kind of things. And then, with the mystics, so I'm reading sort of Julian of Norwich or something, or I'm reading this, studying these sort of, these texts that are having dream visions, so I'm being drawn to these various genres, because I'm teaching my course that way. And then Dune is just kind of flying through these, right? I think a number of you have already mentioned that, sort of these layering of these kind of texts and these historiography, and sort of, I guess, so what sort of came through to me was, I think the ride for me in this first trip through the book was this attention to how many different ways Herbert is telling his story. How many different sort of levels of which he's telling the story. But I came across a quote, so this kind of affirmed me a little bit, also can throw a little wrench into it maybe, from Orson Scott Card's How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy from 1990. And I thought, does he have anything to say anything about Dune? And he has a quote. And I'll finish with this. He just says, When I was reading medieval romances for a graduate class at Notre Dame, I realized that almost every one of these 13th century stories would make a terrific science fiction novel if you just changed the sea to space and the boats to starships. And most science fiction novels could easily be turned into fantasy by changing starships back into ocean-going vessels. Frank Herbert's Dune would fit right in with these best medieval romances if planets became continents and the spice became the source of magical power instead of a drug necessary for space navigation. Now, prior to reading Dune, I thought, okay, that's interesting. Now, after reading Dune, we can certainly have some fun with that, I think. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jason. That's perfect. Reminds me of so many medievalists I know who are enormous science fiction fans, and apparently it's not a coincidence.
Yeah.
Leaf.
All right. No, thanks, everyone, again. And I'm also going to have to keep myself from just engaging in what everyone else is talking about and get back to my script. But so one of the things that I was tracking the most in the novel was the way that planets function as these contained life worlds that shape everything from a character's individual sensibility to the collective capabilities of their inhabitants as populations. And so this comes out of my interest in the way that anthropological ideas of cultural holism affect speculative world building more broadly, and also the way that then speculative writers more recently, certainly since Herbert, have been trying to think about how to grapple with new materialist epistemologies that follow Karen Barad's assertion that we don't obtain knowledge by standing outside the world. We know because we are of the world. And I was reminded of this again because I was teaching a Barad, a theory intro class for my grad students. And I read this right near the end of, I read Barad right as we were getting to the end of Dune Book Club. And I was like, this is what I've been thinking about the whole time. But so the novel emphasizes the importance of being in the world in its initial epigraph by Princess Irulan, which insists that Paul must be understood in relationship to his place, the planet Arrakis. And for much of the novel, this advice seems right. Paul, his mother and sister all become intimately entangled with Arrakis, its inhabitants, the Fremen, and its signature product, the spice. Their mental and physical capabilities are completely rewritten by this intimate entanglement, and they each also acquire new social and kinship identities as well. Moreover, the novel goes out of its way to distinguish and heroize this trinity from other off-worlders by celebrating their ability to adapt themselves to and negotiate with the austere environment of the desert planet. However, Paul's prophetic visions pull him out of this planetary containment, allowing him to see space-time as if from the outside. And here it seems we get into another of these disconnects between what Herbert wants to do and what he did do, which is that despite his efforts to produce an ecological speculation in which the hero is distinguished by his ability to adapt himself to a new place, he ends up producing a disturbing account of a hierarchical society in which people like the Fremen have their fates and characters determined by their worlds, while the exceptional few have access to a transcendental form of knowledge that allows them to manipulate worlds and populations at will. So I'll end there.
Thanks, Lee. That's terrific. Last but not least, Drew.
Yeah, thanks. Min, thanks again for organizing this, and this has also been a highlight of my semester. So I just want to thank everybody else. So what I've I think been thinking about the entire semester is the spice itself, and kind of what sort of substance is it, or what kind of commodity is it really? So much of the novel, as much as it depends on Paul or any other characters, it really depends on the kind of particular characteristics of the spice as a thing that can only be made on, or actually it's not even made, it's sort of produced on Arrakis. It's a thing that can't be manufactured, it can only be produced under specific conditions. So if many forms of capitalist production are scalable, like sugar plantations, they can be practiced under a range of conditions with predictable results. That's not true of the spice. So at the end of the novel, we learn that parts of Arrakis, even though they have all these plans to make it a kind of garden planet, parts of it have to stay desert. They have to stay ruined because that's the only way you can make the spice. The water is toxic to the worms there. So you can't fully manage spice production. You can sort of cut it off, but you can't do it anywhere but Arrakis, and you're always going to need the worms, which are kind of an interesting figure for unpredictable nature. So the text I've been thinking about throughout the semester alongside Dune has been Anna Singh's The Mushroom at the End of the World. I happened to be teaching it when we started this. And so in that book, Matsutake mushrooms grow in spaces that have been raised by capitalism. So her primary example is the destroyed forests of the Pacific Northwest. Like the mushroom, then the spice emerges from conditions of ruin. A planet of gardens won't produce it. You have to have ruin. So for me, the interesting thing about thinking through Dune alongside Singh is that Singh is trying to imagine what capitalism and life look like after kind of totalized extraction. So if Andy Hoberg argues that Dune is part about like neo-colonial modernization, making the deserts of Egypt bloom, that project really can't happen, right? And so I wonder in some ways if that's why Keynes is killed off, because his project is about modernization of Arrakis. So Herbert seems torn between the possibilities of ecological management, sort of good stewardship of Arrakis, and the possibilities of wild spaces that have to be left open. And so I guess to conclude in a kind of really broad-based way, I suspect that some of Dune's contradictions have to do with its emergence from this historical moment, the golden age of US capitalism, that sort of promised utopia, albeit to a limited set of subjects, but depended on forms of extraction and racialized hierarchy that ultimately produced its ruin. So Dune sort of wants to have its spice and eat it too, but that contradiction doesn't fully work. And I think that's part of what makes Dune a durable text for all its faults. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Drew. That's amazing. I feel like I want to talk to each and every one of you at length about your comments, because you were also smart and interesting and add so much. But I also want to open up the conversation to everyone else who, thank you all for joining us. And I see that Orion and Gavin are here, and they contributed actively to the Twitter hashtag every Monday. And if you guys have something to say, I'd love to invite you to say a couple words or a few words before we open up to a general conversation.
I'll go ahead if that's amenable.
Yes, please, Orion.
Okay, and I've got someone who's very helpfully vacuuming outside, so I'll just speak up a little. I hope I can be audible. I've been making notes this whole time, and I have so many things I want to say to everybody else. But instead, I'll just throw something into the conversation that might be of value. I did a reread of Dune last year before this read through with everyone else, which is why it was fresh in my mind. I was going through in order to sort of test the thesis that this was not necessarily an anti-colonial novel, although that's definitely part of it, but that it was a directed critique at the sci-fi Superman, this figure in science fiction history, somebody like John Carter, right? Is it actually critiquing and in some ways kind of tearing down that figure? In the end, what I really got distracted by was the anti-colonialism of it, which is there, but also highly itself orientalized and all those things. What I noticed along the way that I didn't expect to was how much of this book is about puberty, about Paul realizing he's taller than his mom and going, oh no, what does this mean? Losing his father, losing all of his very male masculine teachers, and having to turn into a man, all of which is focalized through giant phallic worms. And I hate to be simplistic about the analysis of it, but when I have time and the ability to think clearly, I'm going to write a paper about this book in puberty, because it is so clearly the boy becoming a man, but in a way where he's noticing himself change. And the vast cosmic powers that he takes on are the equivalent of suddenly realizing you're big enough to break stuff by accident, which as a man who was 6 foot tall by age 12, I can relate to. So those are my really off the cuff thoughts.
Thanks, Ryan. That was terrific. Using incredible restraint not to respond to each and every one of your comments, acting as a neutral moderator. Gavin, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know that you contributed a lot to the conversation, but if you want to take a moment.
No, I don't have anything specific to add and nothing prepared. I'll sort of mimic my life on the Twitter hashtag and just sort of be piggybacking everyone else's fascinating claims. But I think most of my comments during the book club had to do with sort of the reading experience and the structure of the novel itself. And so I'm just sort of madly taking down notes and sort of picking up on everything from Sheila's interest in dramatic irony to Jason's very sort of unique experience reading the book alongside other texts and the different levels of telling the story. Leaf's comments about intimate entanglement, I think, is a really interesting way of thinking about the reading experience of this novel, and how you're invited to engage with paratexts and become entangled in these paratexts, and how that is central, at least to my reading experience, and really sort of that radial kind of reading informing one's encounter right from those opening pages of the book. So I'll stop there, and I'm just eager to sort of see where the conversation goes here.
Thank you, Kevin. That's great. Glad that you were able to participate. I think maybe the way to go forward is if you have something to say, just use the raise hand function and the participants, and I'll just call on you. I'm again going to try to restrain myself from engaging or hogging up the conversation, because I find there's so much to talk about. And if there's no immediate comment, I could certainly set us off in a direction.
Point of order?
Yes, Oren.
How do we raise hands? I'm seeing clapping and thumbs up.
Is it, if you go to, you should be able to go to participants and just click on raise hand.
Thank you.
Mark, you need to turn your microphone on.
I was actually just clicking on the raise hands because I heard it, but I can say something, a couple of things. It was great to follow along on Twitter. I'm sort of too Twitter averse to do anything but lurk, but I was very much enjoying the lurking. Going back to Dune, it's a couple of random things, just picking up on a couple of the individual sort of questions. Back to Vincent. This would be another question, but thinking about the adaptability, the limits of Dune's adaptability. That's a kind of, that it is the kind of Arrakis of sort of IP in a kind of Hollywood sense, that, will Villeneuve get it right? I mean, it has this kind of legendary sort of adaptation failure history, but that's a kind of sort of contemporary question. I guess the other thing I'll just say quickly. The other thing that really sort of struck me going back to it was it's both its sort of formal and to some extent it's sort of narrating, but then also it's kind of gendering of psychology. That the dream sequences, the internal monologues, it's not just sort of Paul's sort of special sort of inner voice that the kind of the Lynch film sort of plays with, but kind of everyone gets that little sort of interior monologuing, and the way it's so marked as sort of psychology. When Lee was speaking about sort of Jordan Peterson and some of the ways in which its sort of emphasis on kind of mental power can be sort of taken, I was thinking just in terms of its sort of adjacency to sort of Scientology sort of est. I mean, not just the way kind of converting the poison through the powers of your body that Jessica does, but even some passage in the middle section where it's sort of like negative energies, sort of, and sort of its mechanics of mind in a way that really made me think about its sort of 60s-ness in thinking about different sort of kinds of psychology. Sort of the California version of it is probably a little more sort of hippie utopian than where it actually ends up, as I think Lee was pointing out. But those are just a couple of things I heard, but I really enjoyed sort of hearing everyone and really enjoyed having the last few months of vicarious Dune following.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that. Vincent, did you want to respond to what Mark said?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was because, like a number of you, this past weekend I was reading Andy Hoberk's article about or contribution about Dune, where Duke Leto and Paul are like this model of this kind of like liberal American subject who can kind of exemplify the beneficence of modernization and like that America is like this decolonized state. But I was kind of thinking of like Villeneuve in this taking on this role in a sense, because I felt to some extent I don't like my critique that of wanting more Arabic actors, in the sense that like one of the things that drew me into the movie and the trailer was that I love so many of those casting choices, but in being this like model of this American liberal director kind of thing, like diversity is the selling point in a lot of ways of that trailer. But it had got me just to start noticing there this kind of like surge of interest in Arabic stories and characters in pop culture, and I just was like started keeping this kind of running list. Like we have these Egyptian inspired stories with Moon Knight, it's a Disney superhero show, and Black Adam, this is a DC superhero. Oscar Isaac is playing Moon Knight. Mark Spector, he's white in the comics, but it was an opportunity to kind of delve into the Egyptian. Black Adam, Dwayne Johnson is playing that character. In Dune, we have Jason Momoa, who is cast as Khal Drogo, which is another kind of Arabic inspired character. Stilgar in this movie, Javier Bardem, Chani is played by Zendaya. And it seems to be interesting that there are these actors that have emerged, like Hawaiian descent, Guatemalan descent, who I think in pop culture have become kind of like generically ethnic. And I love these actors, but it did get me wondering, just like, what would Dune be if it really took the Arabic perspective kind of fully or seriously? If that makes any sense. I mean, I love those actors. I'm excited for the movie, but I just kind of wonder what it would look like, and not only just like to have them in there, but again, in terms of like a minor character elaboration, if their perspective was really kind of given the same weight. So we would wonder at like, what's the strategic alliance with the Atreides from their perspective, rather than, in the book it. Stilgar compliments Duke or kind of questions Duke, that he wants to rule by the consent of the governed. This already implies that he's gonna rule them, as opposed to like what kind of strategic alliance that they would be interested in making. So yeah, those are kind of my response to that a little bit.
Thanks, Vincent. I wonder if we could just stick with this topic. There are lots of others, and I don't want to be the only one to sort of say we should talk about X, Y, or Z. Though I do think gender and race and entanglement and psychology are all really worth thinking about. But I do think it's really noteworthy to pause here and think about its representation of Arabic culture. At least the novel's drawing inspiration for Arabic cultures. I think about how I read this when I was young, and it was really my first introduction to a lot of the ideas about Arabic culture, about Islam. It's certainly the first time I ever came across the word jihad, and it was always this weird way in which I'd hear the news and there'd be talk about Islamic jihad, and the thing that would go in my head was like Dune, right? So in a weird way too, Dune also taught me to think about it from the perspective of the jihadists, and to see it from Paul's perspective. And so much of my understanding early on, when I first came into contact with Islamic culture, was mediated through Dune, right? I mean, I'd like to think it's been superseded since, but it was kind of my first introduction to it. And I wonder, to what degree, we should be paying attention to these questions that Vincent and Mark has brought up. I wonder if anyone else has thoughts on this before we move on to other topics. Orion? And then Andre.
Just a quick thing, because I don't have a complete thought about this yet. My impression is that the film is actually going to substitute those sort of Arabic and pseudo-Arabic terms for things more generic. I don't think they're going to use the term jihad for reasons that are pretty obvious to all of us, right? But this goes back, I think, to what was just said about this sort of de-specificness, this generic ethnicity, which is, a function and a tool of Orientalism itself, to just sort of say everything east of Europe is all the same. So weirdly enough, by taking out those terms and substituting generic terms, we might be stepping even more further away from the specificness that is at the center of the book, even though that specificness is itself, kind of super racist.
Thanks, Brian. Andre?
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much. As a person who arrived very late to this conversation, it's good to participate in it live. I think that some of the ideas that are raised around the sort of the relevance of Dune now really bring to mind how science fiction has generationally adapted its own set of beachheads in other popular media, so that it is now not so much a question of adapting this distinct kind of novel into its own appropriate sort of avant-garde film that is its own sort of art form of making a realistic yet inserting a non-realist narrative into a medium that's meant for a certain kind of realism, where now, because we're habituated to seeing these blockbusters and adapting them from these materials, throwing unlimited resources at realizing this film means that we have an opportunity to see, I think what Orion is talking about is a kind of a purely synthetic reimagination of the human identities and relationships that the novel attempts to fictionalize, but in the language of the novel and the language of a different mode of filmmaking, it does something that I think is actually maybe more true to what the much more diverse ranks of science fiction writers do now, which is extrapolate a whole variety and a really complex and multiply sourced range of ethnic and linguistic and religious references into these future settings in a way that is, for a lot of the writers doing that work, really decolonial. But to put Dune on the big screen, there is, I think, a measure of distancing some things about the novel that we might be able to catch up with now by, say, having native speakers of the languages say the words in the languages, or people with, bilingual and bicultural people speaking words, or having experiences that they can bring to the broader themes of diaspora and colonialism, and even like relationships between pastoralists and agriculturalists in different nation states. All of those things are available to be enacted in performance now, and they're all written by authors and people who can consult as producers, but there's a certain distance that you have to create between Dune as a novel doing that in a way that a lot of contemporary viewers are going to view as appropriation, and what is possible for authors in other art forms, like works of fiction that intersect with and maybe are inspired by seeing what's possible on screen. So it's a real kind of return of the repressed to see on screen now, but it's also kind of a gesture to like, oh, science fiction actually kind of is like this now in terms of what readers are seeing. Maybe we're accustomed to it, but it's exciting and off-putting at the same time to know that it has to be realized in a way that's going to forgo some things that might make it one of the most current, one of the most exciting possible film versions of a science fiction novel right now.
Thanks, Andre. That's great. Lee, you have a response?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I'll say is I did notice in the trailer that there's reference to a crusade rather than a jihad. And so I think there is a specific attempt to get away from the kind of that language. At the same time, I wonder to what degree the kind of multiracial, ambiguous casting might in some way serve the purposes of the novel better than one that like was say more kind of directly, you know, thinking about the kind of the colonialist context of composition and modernization theory. Only to the degree that like religion is really weird in this book. Like it's I think we're meant to understand, right? Like I was reading the appendices, and there's a long appendix about the composition of the Orange Catholic Bible, and it's like an explicitly cynically syncretic text that is meant to fuse many faith traditions together. And so it's a kind of odd thing, like to what degree is Islam kind of like an important dimension of Herbert's thought versus a kind of another ingredient in the stew for him, you know, to the kind of the science fiction utopianism that imagines that the future is going to like kind of syncretically take different elements of our present, remix them, and it'll come out on the other side kind of, you know, like, you know, unrecognizably different yet somehow familiar at the same time. And I'm reading this book at the same time that I taught in my sci-fi class, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. And that novel does a lot of the same things with race, where, you know, the moon happens to be a kind of post-racial society because the sourcing, you know, of human nation states is diverse, and people just kind of mix together, and you know, like you really don't know, you know, where someone comes from unless you really kind of pay attention to the details. And so I don't know, like I'm not saying that it's a good choice or a bad choice in terms of the casting, but like I question to what degree Herbert was really conscious of what he was doing. I mean, you know, like that's the limit of my knowledge. Maybe he knew what he was doing more than I give him credit for.
Thanks, Lee. That's great. Any more thoughts on this before we move on? There's a lot to be said about it, but I don't want to
Actually,
stuck on this topic. James?
I can't raise my hand, unfortunately. I think the co-moderators can't actually hand raise.
Well, you can just raise your hands physically.
There we go. The comments so far, I mean, there's a lot in them, and I wonder if I might do something I shouldn't, which is try to draw them all together. But like Sheila's comments, I think made me a bit of a liar, Sheila. And the comments on race come back to like what I was trying to think about in terms of the problem of indigeneity in his later texts. And although it's a generalization, if we think of indigeneity as rootedness in place, then this discussion of, say, capital being rooted in agriculture and landscape, and you know, the daring thing to try to draw them all together. Sheila's comments on landscape were virtually a paraphrase of Lawrence Durrell's comments on in Landscape and Character, an essay that was sort of making its rounds just before this book came out. What would happen if we were to flip that and say things like, you know, the issues of race that we have in adaptation, and how this film is being adapted, and how race plays out in the novel, and how it plays out in the films, and how it's going to play out in this new film, and so many other films like James Bond, when it's supposed to be Cuba, they set it in Greece because it's easier, and all the Greeks say por favor because it's still Cuba, and who cares because it's just, you know, other people. And what happens if we rejig that idea of capital coming out of landscape and all of these other things to look at someone like David Graeber from that more anarchic perspective that someone like Durrell draws me back to, and look at debt preceding capital? In which case we have adaptation and genre. And before we get the book, we already have the genre. Before we get the film, we have it as an adaptation of the novel that comes before it. And all of those are debts, and all of them shape our expectations and give us the thing that we're obliged to fulfill. Among which is this generalization of ethnicity as, you know, different from the mainstream, that is therefore the defining feature of the film. And maybe that's too much to put into a comment, but that's been sort of percolating as everyone's talked.
Thanks, James. It's a lot. It's a lot. One thing I've also been wondering about, I mean, I think we could spend another hour easily talking about race and genre, but I've also been really struck by the gender disparities. I mean, not only in terms of what's happening in the novel, as Deborah points out, but also in the people who've volunteered to participate in this book club. It's a very male, asymmetric audience. And I wonder if it makes sense for us to just kind of recognize that and have a discussion about how gender works with this work and with genre. And I was also struck too that in the middle of our book club, Jordan Carroll published a terrific article in the LA Review of Books, and Greg Gandon as well also published a terrific article that brought to the foreground, right, the ways in which Dune has been really adopted by the far right and has become also a kind of, sort of a hyper-masculinist kind of text. I think sort of Frank Herbert's ambivalence about Paul as a kind of messiah figure gets flattened out in those discourses as a kind of an embrace. And maybe this also speaks to what Orion was saying about it being a kind of, maybe like a proto-young adult novel about the experience of male adolescence or coming into manhood and what does it mean to be a man. So I just wonder if I could just ask people to reflect on gender for a bit. Orion?
Just as one, I noticed you going from the gender disparity of the novel to the gender disparity of this particular experience we're having, and it immediately made me think of the gendered experience of being on Twitter itself. By picking that medium, we're already going into a space that is, I cannot emphasize enough, horribly hostile to women, especially women with opinions. And then layer on top of that, the gender bottleneck of academia itself. I mean, we've arrived at the end of a process that sheds and pushes women out at every step of the way, as well as people of color and queer people and trans people and disabled people and etc. So I just thought I'd add that layer.
Yeah. Sheila.
Good point, Orion. Thank you for that. It's true. I was just thinking, Min, as you were speaking a moment ago about the gender dynamics of the group and also of the novel. I mean, obviously the novel fails spectacularly, the Bechdel test. I can't imagine any version of the movie that wouldn't as well, but it'll be interesting to see how they deal with that, maybe in a sort of, Star Wars reboot sense. It also obviously really fails to resist the traditional, Madonna whore dichotomy. That's pretty much all we got for female characters in the novel. I was interested in reading it and I came to it late, just out of my interest in other science fiction. I felt like in not having reckoned with Dune, I was missing something that I needed to reckon with. And so when I first read it, which I did about 4 years ago, I picked it up during the summer and I was cognizant of the fact that every time I did so in public, some guy would come up to talk to me about how I was reading Dune. And then I would say that I was doing it for the first time and they're like, oh my God, you haven't read Dune yet? Wow, you're so far behind. And so it eventually became this thing that I wanted to do on the down low by myself where I didn't have to have these conversations with people. Because I did get the sense that this was a rite of passage for men and men who like science fiction in a way that it wasn't necessarily or hadn't been for me, which is why it had taken me so long to get around to doing it. So then I had to stop talking about how I was reading Dune in order to avoid those conversations.
Thanks, Sheila. I think it was kind of implicit too in your comment that you were reluctant to have your students read it. Just I think maybe for the kind of gendered conversations that were enough.
That was part of it. I mean, thinking about teaching that as myself in a class of almost all men. It was a class of 30 students, 27 would probably be men every time I taught it. I decided I just didn't want to do that.
That is absolutely hilarious. and I'm sure completely true. This is probably a difficult book to read in public for a woman.
Well, for anybody, really, I would think, partly because of the kinds of identifications that have been formed with it, as were, Adam rated so completely in that Lorem article. I mean, it strikes me, Lee was talking about the misreadings of the book, right? And it strikes me that it's a text that gets misread the way so many other texts get misread these days, like Born in the USA or, Fortunate Son. Or for that matter, a host of other texts that can be harnessed for the demands of puberty and militarism, right? And I was thinking back to the way that Sheila was commenting early in our discussions about Jessica, and how Jessica seemed like the moral center of the book, and in many ways the hero of the book, and the way in which our we all sort of said, that's right, that sounds right, because I think Herbert makes us feel early on in the book that somehow her character, the destiny she carries, her choices are important and valid, and then completely throws them out the window at the end of the book. I mean, not just in that horrible sort of, just pandering last line, but also just in terms of the way in which she is swallowed up by Paul's destiny. And in a sense, she swallows the Fremen history, and then in turn is swallowed by Paul's destiny. And so there are no choices left at the end of the book. I mean, I tend to see the book as much more foreclosed than a lot of people do. I mean, I see it as almost self-erasing. But I think that it's particularly so when you think about gender. All the women on that last page of the book just, either they literally collapse in the heap like the Reverend Mother, or they basically sort of say, oh, we will get our real, acknowledgement in the pages of history, or they start writing the pages of history which are entirely devoted to Paul. I mean, there is literally no choice, nothing left. And I know that the sequels do something different with that. But it seems to me that within the novel itself, we are left absolutely hapless and hopeless.
Thanks, Deborah. Mark? And then John? Sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I want to... This isn't specifically... I mean, I actually found it's sort of fairly irredeemable at the level of gender. I mean, just that was a bold comment. I mean, even not in an uninteresting way. I mean, it's kind of theory of why the theory of why or how gender works, especially that kind of, there's a place where a woman can't look. What's there? Paul. It's just like looking back out at them. There's something. I mean, that's a not uninteresting borderline misogyny in its own way. But on but maybe on the getting something that Deborah said early on, thinking about the novel's form, that it makes me think about Dune's legacy. That there's things that rereading Dune that it brought out in comparable works of science fiction that I like better, and that I think in a kind of moral, formal politics kind of are better. But Dune made me realize that there's maybe things that there are kind of missing too, and I think it's weird formal commitment to a kind of masculine hero story kind of brings that out. So I mean, Dune seems like it's required for Kim Stanley Robinson to write the Mars trilogy. I think we can all agree Kim Stanley Robinson's politics are, thumbs up for Kim Stanley Robinson in ways that Frank Herbert's a kind of more complicated character. But then it makes me think about the sort of profound secularism of Kim Stanley Robinson's novels. That there's no, getting back to Lee's comment, there's no religion that at least Dune's sort of weird universe starts with a kind of religion. I mean, Kim Stanley Robinson has it sort of in places, but it's especially in some of the more recent stuff, it's a fairly sort of secular sort of set of novels. And on the other hand, thinking back to, if we wanted a different sort of dynamic or different, if this would have been a book club on the Broken Earth trilogy, there you'd have a much different sort of, maybe a potentially different. But even so, that Jesmond's novels, which again I think are fantastic, going back to Dune made me think about, does Jesmond actually sort of sufficiently sort of confront extraction capitalism as the kind of core, as the kind of original sin for the kind of narrative universe she built. So again, so there's things that Dune does well that I think are kind of caught up in the things that it kind of sort of nails on a chalkboard experience.
Thanks.
Parts of its world too.
Thanks, Mark. Those are really provocative comments. We've got several other people who want to speak. I saw John Adams, you had your hand up. I think Jason, you had your hand up, and then Nathan.
Yeah, my comment was actually just to add to sort of Deborah's insights, which I thought were really great, to say that what she's saying is really exemplified in like how the choices are even talked about. So all of Jessica's choices, the choice to train Paul in these ways, the choice to sort of set him up to become who he is to become, happen outside of the book. They happen off screen, right? Once we're sort of in this nature and the writing of the book, they're out of her hands. And that even shows in sort of the scene where they're escaping death, right? Where at this point, she can do nothing because she's bound, she's gagged, she's torn up, and she has to just pray that the choices she made in the past, that this sort of birth of this life that she's given to Paul carries through. And so I think that really is, problematic, that we don't even get the essence of possible choices for Jessica. She's just bound throughout the rest of the book to the choices that she made before the book even began.
Thanks, John. Jason?
I guess I would just echo sort of some of the things that Sheila said early on. Again, as I was kind of starting into this, I was reading that, the medieval literature and kind of looking at it through a gendered perspective. A lot of the criticism that I look at with medieval literature tends to be that way. But I don't know, I just wanted to throw maybe a specific question and get a response possibly from Sheila or Deborah or others on Paul's tears, that scene where Paul sort of, his tears, what do we make of that if we're thinking about masculinity and emotion, or tears what do you think of Paul's tears? What is the significance of that, maybe, if there's a reading of that?
Yes, and it's so important too, because he's wasting his water over it, right? So it's like the ultimate gesture of sacrifice, that he's wasting his personal water, which in itself is oddly masculine, right? But he's making that sacrifice of the body.
Great point. Nathan, and then John Evlev.
Thanks. And it's great to be able to listen in on this, having lurked a little bit in on the Twitter discussion. And yeah, I read this novel, as part of that adolescent boy sort of rite of passage some years ago, and have since become interested in climate, in teaching a class about possible futures of the planet. And I'm curious to what extent, how do we think about, and this is building somewhat on Leif's comments, but about the Anthropocene, about the planet and the constraint here. It strikes me, so I taught Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed earlier this year, and that was published 75, so it's a little bit later, but there's a similar, desert planet, Anaras, but with a very different politics. The scarcity of the planet there enables or forces or allows a kind of utopian anarchism, whereas in Arrakis, Herbert seems to imagine that only the violence and hierarchy are the responses to that scarcity. So that's some of what's been going through my head, and I'm curious how other folks have thought about that.
Thanks, Nathan. That's a great comment. John, and then I think Drew had your hand up a little bit, and then James. But John, you're being patient.
Hi, thanks. So I did not participate at all in the Twitter. I'm not on Twitter, and I'm actually a 19th century Americanist, and came to this through Kyla, who then didn't come actually. So, but what was interesting is I read this when I was a teenager, and read through the original trilogy, and had sort of dipped. I think basically I'd sort of stopped reading science fiction somewhat when some of the additional books came out. And one of the things that happened when I was exchanging some ideas with Kyla, she said, "Oh, I love these, some of these later books from the original Herbert books." And one of the things I was really struck, and so I've started reading them just now. I just picked them up in the sort of end of term thing. and I'm reading The Heretics of Dune. And what's really fascinating about it is it's kind of like a whole reset, in which he kind of they start thinking about a new Messiah and things like that, except it's all from the perspective of the Bene Gesserit. So it's all women, all talking about the decisions they would make about how to sort of set this up. And there are two Messiah figures, and one's a young woman and one's a Gola of Duncan, Idaho. They're on these sort of millionth iteration of Gola. You know, it's all very elaborate, but what's interesting is there's, so far, and I'm about midway through, there's almost no interest in the consciousness of the messiahs themselves. And it's all about the women and the decisions they're making about how to sort of deal with this. And so it feels very much like a kind of reconsideration of some of the things, the problems that some of you have been talking about, you know, that he was himself sort of reconsidering this. And it's much more, it's even more deeply invested in some of the religious image stuff, and so starts to think about Sufism and Zen Sunni stuff in interesting ways that, well, I mean, I was surprised, and I'm actually kind of really enjoying it, but also finding it, having reread Dune, I sort of did find it a little flat, sort of. So but I'm actually finding this more interesting, more engaging. So if you would encourage people, they want to follow up, you do have to get yourself through God Emperor of Dune, which kind of, that was it for me as a teenager. I was like, okay, that was it. But I would say it gets better, you know? So,
Thanks, John. Drew, and then James.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think it's sort of interesting to think about like the model of masculinity we're presented with Paul. Like he's not precisely kind of post-feminist, but there's something kind of like rising counterculture in Paul's persona. I mean, he inherits the Bene Gesserit tradition, and it maybe sort of gives men like us permission to read this novel and not feel like we're full on participating in that superhero culture that that Herbert seems interested in critiquing. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Thanks, Drew. James?
I wanted to comment on the Le Guin part, but I also wanted to say, like, part of it is this individuation process for Jungian psychology that Herbert's really dedicated to, which is that Paul's the only one who becomes, you know, an integrated human being, or a clear, is that the Dianetics term? So he integrates his masculine and feminine sides. But for the Le Guin comment, which was Nathan, I really like the comment, but I would quarrel over the utopianism, because what fascinates me is that you've got someone like Samuel Delany, who will write a 100-page essay saying, I am not influenced by Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed. Here's a novel I wrote that's actually based on that novel, and I've got a fantasy series that's kind of like Earthsea, and I'm going to wrap that back into the same world as the science fiction novel that's responding to Le Guin, but I'm not influenced. And she's awful and she's terrible. Don't read her. And then you don't really get him saying much about Dune, you know, the quasi-fascistic, racist, Islamophobic, really troubling patriarchal novel. And I'm kind of curious why, and I think it comes back to that issue of the utopia, where Le Guin's book, I would say, is anti-utopian. Like, you have this anarchist, quote unquote, utopia, but, you know, they're miles away from being good enough. They're just, you know, they're on the right path. They're doing things right, but they're not getting to utopia. And Herbert's more like, you know, we're going to get there. And sure, there's going to be a lot of bodies and some gulags and you know, a lot of genocide, but we're going to get to that perfect world, and it's coming through Paul. And I think Le Guin would say, if that's utopia, I'm not okay with it. And I'll just go on record saying, I'm not okay with that. But that, you know, that's a real problem in sci-fi, where, like, you know, are we going to accept that utopianism and the cost that it comes with, which is getting rid of all the stuff that isn't utopian?
Orion, and then Lee.
James just described fascist utopia. We will get there by killing all the people we don't like and achieving ultimate hierarchical order. Like, you just said it perfectly. And this, if I may, loops back to the thing I wanted to say a while ago that I think applies to a lot of our conversation. How you take this book has really a lot to do with whether or not you consider Paul's last scene, where he is spitting mad at everybody after having defeated the universe, whether you are unsettled by that or kind of excited by it. If you find it unsettling, then this is a book that absolutely excoriates a lot of fashy, ultra-patriarchal stuff, although I don't think that you would also catch all the racism. That's a separate discussion. If, however, you look at that and go, yes, that's awesome, he's great, he's a badass, then you are on the path to being one of those guys who misreads the book and finds it to be a guidebook to fascism. And I think that last scene has everything to do with it. When I read it at 13, I didn't see anything about that scene that was satirical or self-effacing at all. At 43, when I reread it, I went, oh. And that visceral reaction, I think, has everything to do with how you sort of backwardly look at the rest of the book.
Thanks for that. Lee, and then Leah.
Yeah, I would kind of second what you said, Orion, in that, like, it's the capacity to reread the book, to misread the book, is like a function of like how uninterested Dune is in like foregrounding what it is that Paul has committed himself to. Like, you read it and he's like, oh nope, we got to go with the jihad now. Oops, like, and it's like you can almost miss that between, like, the knife fights and the kind of machinations that are kind of going on in the foreground. And I'm in the middle of God Emperor right now, and I'm kind of making my way through for the first time, and it's rough going. But like the sequels are all about like just reminding you what is kind of hidden there. It's like saying, no, everyone, you misread the first book. Here's a scene in which Paul explicitly compares himself to Hitler, and he's kind of like comparing body counts. He's like, well, Emperor Hitler, how many people did he kill? Well, I killed this many people. And he's not like happy about it. He's aware, like Herbert is, that he is a fascist, genocidal tyrant. And yet, those sequels really try to like foreground that dystopian or say fascist utopian element of the previous books. And yet what's interesting about the sequels is that like they still can't dig themselves out from that hole. They keep replicating the gesture of the Messiah narrative over and over again, with Paul's descendants, and even Paul's kind of inability to, convince people that he's a bad person, like it doesn't land with the reader in certain ways. So that's kind of interesting. And then I actually just taught The Dispossessed and Delaney's essay on The Dispossessed, and he does mention Dune, but like the thing he mentions about Dune is the ornithopters. He's like, oh, the ornithopters are a really good example of the discourse of science fiction and the way it helps you imagine a whole world based on a single word. But he says almost nothing else about Dune. So I don't know. He obviously read it, but he just chose not to go there. Anyway, so more to say, but I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Lee. Yes? Lee, did you have something to say?
Oh, I guess, yeah, I'm still pigging back to Nathan's comment, and I guess just thinking about these notions of these austere planetscapes, whether it's Inares or the other Le Guin one would of course be I'm blanking on the Left-Handed Darkness planet right now. Geffen, there we go. But like there are all these spaces that are like sort of imagined, like, and in Geffen it's like, well, maybe that's why they don't have any war, is just because it's too damn cold. And but I guess what's interesting is, and I think for me this is what's weird about another weird part of Herbert is, like, there's a desire for the Fremen to be compelling, but he also does not actually, he cannot be bothered to world build Fremen culture at all. Like outside of like a few words and we like to fight. And so I think there's a really interesting sort of distinction between this sense of like the Fremen are so compelling and they transform these important people, but like the way that we'll tell you that is through some spice-enabled info dumps that that let Jessica just magically become part of all of Fremen culture, so he doesn't have to be bothered to actually write any narrative description of what people might learn. And so I feel like that's another weird sort of moment of like, I don't know if it's just like not being interested in cultural transformation or not understanding how to write that, but it feels like that's one of the limit cases in the novel.
I think that's right. You know, it's remarkable how little the Freeman characters actually get to speak at all, even though they play such a major role. They're really almost a plot device in the novel to allow Paul to realize some of his own ambitions. I have to say, like, just listening to this conversation, really, I think kind of re-up something that I've been thinking about throughout the book club, and that is there was a part of me that kind of wished I hadn't written that tweet to suggest that we should read this book together. There may be other books that would be better to read, that would be a better use of our time. Maybe we should have all been reading The Dispossessed. You know, and part of it was my own nostalgia for, you know, for my boyhood. Thinking about how formative this book was, and then it's also in the popular media. And I have to say, you know, as much as I think we can read against the grain at the end of the novel, there's also, though, throughout, you know, a real fascination with fascism and with authoritarianism. I don't think Herbert himself is completely, like, you know, clean-handed about these issues. You know, and I don't think it's a mistake that actually, like, far-right groups might glom to this, you know, and might glom onto this. And also, you know, the movie versions. I mean, I saw the 1980s version of it just because I was curious to revisit that version. And it has zero ambivalence about what Paul is doing, right? He's the savior, he's a messiah figure. It's a celebration of his violence. And it really concerns me, actually, that the new version is only going to end with the first half of the book, that it doesn't carry all the way to the end. It only ends right in the middle. And if you end the novel there, right in the middle, I think you'd be really bloodthirsty. You know, you want revenge on Barrett, you want the Harkonnens to be humiliated, you want him to go on a jihad. And that's, you know, I think the very opposite of the kind of ambivalence that Herbert introduces at the very end for readers who are really attuned to it. But I think the other thing that I just want to take this moment to say is this discussion has also really made me think of how serious this conversation is, actually, and how high the stakes are. You know, in a way, like when we talk about other novels, you know, that has traditionally been considered serious fiction, I think the stakes are not quite as high. You know, I mean, I think we are always in danger here in this forum when it goes public, of someone who's very right-wing, who will take umbrage at the criticisms we convey at their favorite work of literature, you know, and will be like the objects of hate mail for, you know, for putting down a work that they value so much. You know, I think the stakes are very high. You know, the attachment to this book is very high. And I think what Orion was saying, you know, I think its attachment is so much to do as well with its connection to a particular kind of masculine formation, an idea of masculinity that, you know, I mean, I do think it really is a Bildungsroman of a particular kind of manhood, right? Founded prominently on violence. It's actually a really disturbing idea of masculinity that it's conveying to its audience. And the fact that it keeps getting recycled again and again, I think is worrisome. I think Orion, you have your hand up. You want to take the last word? We're running out of time here, so you don't want to do that. Okay.
Sorry, very quick historical note. I once heard an interview with David Lynch where he talked about exactly that problem, that the producers of the movie, the money people, didn't understand that Paul's not a good guy. He was not trying to make that movie. Alan Smithy made that movie. And so that production is mired in exactly the problem we're discussing. That's all.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. That's exactly right. I was shocked to discover, I think it was in the Greg Grandin article, that there's a 4-hour version of that film out there. And I was like, where can I see that 4-hour version? It's got to be better than the one I saw. Anyone have a last comment before we adjourn? We have 1 more minute left, I think.
I think on behalf of everyone, we'd just like to thank you for the work you've done, bringing us all together and making this possible, man. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining me. I would have felt very silly if I was the only one trying to relive my childhood here. But thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone's comments. This was fantastic. Thank you.
I will say one thing just for fun and context. I came to Dune from my older sister, who is also my portal to most things weird science fiction. And I'll figure out what that means offline when I talk to her next.
Well, you know, I think the gender stuff, I mean, I just, as a coda to this, I was telling people earlier before we began that this is actually my very first experience with ASAP. I went to the symposium in London and I gave a talk about the gender turn in contemporary American literature. And I talked about science fiction as kind of unproblematically masculine. And so the whole Q&A was the audience just ripping into me for my assumptions about gender. That was an unpleasant experience, but so I'm glad that we were able to have a much more sophisticated version of what I was trying to talk about at that time. Thanks, everybody. This has been great.